One fateful afternoon, a hush falls over Hosea Kutako International Airport as immigration officers pin brand-new visa-required placards above every arrivals queue for U.S. passport holders. Cameras click, phones buzz, and murmurs ripple through the terminal. Moments later, the news splashes across African and Western headlines alike. Namibia, led by its trailblazing first female president, Nandi-Ndaitwah, has flipped the script on America's long-standing travel privilege. Overnight, the doors that once swung wide for U.S. citizens have been fitted with locks, and the keys now cost $90 and a fresh set of paperwork. For decades, Americans breezed into Windhoek to photograph desert elephants, prospect for diamonds, and clinch raw materials contracts, all while Namibian applicants for U.S. visas languished in labyrinthine queues and endured interrogations that sometimes felt less like interviews and more like cross-examinations. How many family members do you have? Prove you'll return. Why should we trust you? The imbalance was stark, yet tolerated, until now. On 1st April 2025, President Nandi-Ndaitwah's administration unveiled its new mantra, reciprocity or nothing. If an African passport triggers extra scrutiny in Atlanta or Los Angeles, an American passport will now trigger identical scrutiny in Windhoek and Walvis Bay. No special corridors, no unquestioned entry stamps. Respect is a two-way street, the information minister declared. We are simply paving ours. But here's the twist that jolted Washington awake. The decree wasn't limited to future arrivals. A nationwide audit of immigration records unearthed more than 500 American nationals already inside Namibia, whose paperwork was expired, incomplete, or altogether non-existent. Some were laid-back adventurers overstaying tourist visas on the Skeleton Coast. Many, however, were deep in Namibia's economic engine room, operating heavy machinery in uranium pits, managing safari lodges, or quietly extracting rare earth metals critical to global tech supply chains. Under previous governments, these lapses might have drawn a polite reminder. Under Nandi-Ndaitwah, they drew expulsion orders with a 7-day countdown. Why did those Americans ignore the new rules? Did they assume another grace period was coming? Did they believe, as one anonymous expat confessed to local radio, that visa on arrival is just a formality for foreigners like us? Whatever the rationale, Namibia's Home Affairs Ministry wasn't persuaded. Deportation notices were hand-delivered. Police escorts stood by. Commercial airlines were alerted. The message rang louder than any diplomatic cable. Namibia will not babysit guests who disregard its sovereignty. Predictably, the echo reached Mar-a-Lago, where former U.S. President Donald Trump reportedly fumed that Africa was slamming the door on Americans. Yet Namibia's policy is less a door slamming shut than a mirror held up to decades of asymmetry. How many African graduate students have missed U.S. orientation weeks because their visas arrived 2 semesters late? How many entrepreneurs lost deals after embassy denials stamped insufficient ties? Namibia simply asked, shouldn't courtesy flow both ways? The new regulations are straightforward. American travelers must complete an online pre-arrival form, or queue at the airport counter, and pay roughly US $90 for a 30-day visa that can be extended only with documented justification. Overstay by a single day, and the fine escalates steeply. Work without the proper permit, and you forfeit not only your job, but your freedom to remain. We are not anti-tourism, the president clarified in her Independence Day address. We are pro-dignity. Will the 500-plus Americans pack up voluntarily before immigration officers begin escorted removals? Will Washington retaliate with stricter measures, or will it quietly revise its own policies to avoid the optics of hypocrisy? And if Namibia succeeds in enforcing reciprocal respect, how many other African nations, long frustrated by one-sided visa regimes, will follow suit? One thing is already certain. The age when Western passports sailed unchallenged through African airspace is fading into the desert sunset. A new dawn is breaking over the red sands of the Kalahari, and its first light carries a bold inscription: equal gates, equal rules, equal respect. The world is watching, especially those Americans now racing to catch the next flight out of Windhoek. Why should one passport open doors while another slams into a wall of questions? That was the riddle Namibia's first female head of state, President Nandi-Ndaitwah, set out to solve, and she solved it with a single crystal-clear rule. If a Namibian needs a visa for Washington, an American will now need a visa for Windhoek. No anger, no fists on the podium, just a calm insistence on fairness. But she didn't stop there. In the same breath, the president introduced a second, history-making measure. Every African passport holder may now enter Namibia visa-free. While U.S. travelers line up for paperwork and a $90 fee, Africans will stroll through the arrival hall with a welcoming stamp. Why? Because in her words, Africa is not the problem. Africa is the solution. The goal is grand yet simple. Turn a patchwork of 54 borders into a single neighborhood where no African feels like a stranger on African soil. Across the continent, cheers erupted. Pan-African thinkers praised Namibia for putting dignity above diplomacy as usual. Yet in Washington, and in a few polished offices across Europe, whispers of concern grew louder. If Namibia could flip the script, who might follow next? Could this spark a continental wave of visa parity? Or will Western capitals retaliate with travel warnings and economic pressure? One thing is certain, the old imbalance is cracking. Why choose the United States as the first target? Because the numbers told an embarrassing story. A Namibian entrepreneur who seeks a U.S. visa must endure background checks, bank statement drills, and a coin flip chance of rejection, often for reasons never fully explained. Meanwhile, American tourists landed in Namibia without so much as filling out a form. They snapped selfies at Fish River Canyon, managed lodges in Etosha, and even dug diamonds from the desert, all under an automatic welcome mat. So President Ndaitwah ordered a full audit of immigration records. More than 500 Americans were soon flagged for expired visas, or none at all. Many weren't backpackers on a time-blurring holiday. They were running safari companies, drilling uranium, operating unlicensed NGOs, and even dabbling in faith missions outside official oversight. When told to rectify their status, most failed Namibia's standard immigration checks. Work permits, qualifications, tax compliance, all missing. That's when the hammer fell. 7 days to leave or face formal deportation. U.S. Embassy staff pleaded for an extension. Lobbyists fired off memos warning of serious bilateral strain. The president didn't blink. Sovereignty is not negotiable, she told reporters. Police escorts were organized, airline manifests checked, and immigration officers stationed at every exit gate. Critics called the move hostile. Supporters called it long overdue. But the deeper question remains. Will Africa's other 53 nations demand the same mutual respect? Or will economic threats twist their arms back into old habits? Whatever the outcome, Namibia has drawn a bright, unmistakable line, one that says passports, like people, deserve equal dignity under the sun-bleached skies of Windhoek. And now, as U.S. travelers weigh their next African getaway, they must ask themselves a brand new question. Do I have my visa? Welcome to the era of balanced gates and shared respect. Namibia's bold stance has shifted the conversation from individual travelers to the deeper question of national dignity, and the nation's leaders have made it clear that their actions are not an attack on anyone, but a declaration of equality. Before moving on, imagine pausing a moment to ask yourself, are you intrigued by this unfolding story? And if so, would you share it and invite others to join our exploration of Black Africa's changing narrative? Now back to events on the ground. Namibia never singled out Americans merely to stir headlines. It highlighted a glaring hypocrisy in global mobility. The United States applies its immigration rules with iron discipline, deporting those who overstay, yet the moment Namibia enforces identical standards on U.S. citizens, pundits label it controversial. Namibia refuses that double standard, standing firm against any hint of intimidation, insisting that reciprocity is not vengeance, but mutual respect. After all, if Americans must secure visas for Russia, China, or Brazil, why should Africa, arguably the most historically exploited continent, be expected to wave them through without question? Namibia's move was calculated, not emotional, sending ripples through consulates worldwide. Africa is done being the playground of unchecked privilege. As urgent cables flew between embassies in Windhoek and Western capitals, Namibian officials calmly reminded the world that every nation controls its borders, something the US proudly asserts each day. Yet when Namibia exercises the same right, critics cry foul, exactly the contradiction this policy aims to expose. Why is it routine for African students to be detained, fingerprinted, and interrogated at US entry points, while Americans breeze through African airports? Namibia's answer is a firm no more, and that message rattled not only Washington but Europe as well. Germany, still sensitive about its colonial past in Namibia, discreetly inquired whether the new visa rule might sweep in EU citizens. Windhoek replied that true reciprocity means Germans enjoy in Namibia only what Namibians enjoy in Berlin. The diplomatic shock was amplified by headlines announcing the impending removal of 500 non-compliant US nationals, an unprecedented act that humiliated figures like Donald Trump and jolted the US State Department. Tourism losses might be absorbed, but the symbolic blow was radioactive. An African nation had flipped the usual script and told Washington, not asked. Inside Foggy Bottom, officials scrambled through playbooks. Would economic aid be the first lever? Namibia receives significant US funding, particularly via USAID and PEPFAR. Suspending or slicing those programs could be framed as a review, yet everyone would know it was punishment. Still, Namibia anticipated this. Trump had already floated cutting foreign aid, and Windhoek planned contingencies. Retaliation need not be loud. Diplomatic downgrades can unfold in quiet strokes. High-level meetings vanish, embassy staff shrink, visa processing for Namibian officials grinds to a snail's crawl labeled administrative review. Such pressure is designed to remind smaller nations of their supposed place, but Namibia has chosen a different lesson, one it hopes others in Africa will quickly study. By making Americans queue for a visa like everyone else, Windhoek has cracked the facade of Western passport privilege. Will Washington respond with measured diplomacy, or with the quiet squeeze of delayed paperwork and redirected funds? Namibia seems unfazed, convinced that reclaiming sovereignty is worth any cost. In that confidence, the age-old model of one-way respect begins to crumble, and the world now waits to see whether other African capitals will follow the same uncompromising path. Quiet forms of pressure rarely make front-page headlines, yet their purpose is unmistakable. Remind any African government that dares challenge US privilege that doors can close just as quickly as they open. Washington could, for instance, weaponize trade. Namibia currently enjoys favored access to American markets under the African Growth and Opportunity Act, a program meant to boost exports from the continent. With a single notice of non-cooperation or unfavorable business climate, that lifeline could vanish. The chill might not stop there. Institutions tightly intertwined with US influence, the European Union, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, could suddenly delay loans, stall infrastructure projects, or let development grants evaporate without obvious explanation. Multinationals with US ties might receive subtle encouragement to review their investments in Windhoek. Yet every potential punishment only strengthens Namibia's core argument. If a nation is penalized merely for insisting on equal treatment, what does that say about Western principles of fairness? The underlying message, obedience over parity, now echoes across African capitals. And here is where retaliation risks spectacular blowback. Africa in 2025 is not the Africa of a generation ago. Governments from Lagos to Nairobi increasingly court partnerships with China, Russia, BRICS, and intra-African blocs that emphasize sovereignty over submission. Should Washington lean too hard, it may push more countries, Nigeria, Ghana, South Africa, Kenya, to follow Namibia's lead, demanding visa reciprocity and redrawing the rulebook with the West. Of course, America could still tighten the screws, slash aid, slow visas to a crawl, throttle trade corridors, or enlist global lenders as silent enforcers. Yet by doing so, It could spark precisely the scenario it dreads, a continent no longer waiting cap in hand for permission. If a single medium-sized nation can say enough and weather the storm, imagine an entire continent acting in concert. That's a geopolitical headache Washington is scarcely prepared to medicate, and Windhoek knows it. So, will the United States retaliate? Possibly. Will Africa flinch? History suggests otherwise. The continent has endured coups, sanctions, and veiled threats. What it has lacked, until recently, is a shared determination to stand united. Namibia's move may have just ignited that collective spark. What's your view on President Nandi-Ndaitwah's demand for Western visitors to secure visas before stepping onto Namibian soil? Should every African nation insist on the same standard so the West finally tastes its own medicine? And how do you expect Donald Trump, or any future U.S. leader, to react when 500 American citizens are summarily shown the departure gate by an African state? Share your thoughts below, subscribe, and tap the bell so you don't miss our deep dives into Black Africa's untold stories, its history, art, culture, and bold new politics.